Donc sur cette suite de la table ronde, on va essayer de se concentrer.
For the rest of the round table, we'll try to focus on production. We could see the different illustrations. The list of contaminants is pretty long, and it has an impact on end products. As Denise also said, a lot is expected from production in terms of raw material guarantees. So we need controls, monitoring, to stop us from buying the wrong plant. But what can the producer do with this plant, and is it interesting for them to keep their activity, their business? So we need testimonies from the producer's point of view, because how do you move from warning to regulation, and regulation from implementation in the producer, because our entire sector depends on the raw material and its availability. So we need compliant raw material. So to have this illustration, we've invited 3 speakers. These 3 speakers can tell us about issues on different cultures, either medicinal plants, but also aromatic plants, with different sizes of companies to see what can be implemented based on the size of your company, and also that are focusing on different markets. Because you can have the same plant used in cosmetics, pharmaceuticals, food supplements, and it's an additional difficulty to manage all these differences because regulations can be different, a client's expectation can be different. So for our testimonies, we have Isabelle RIPOCHE from the company Promoplantes. She's in charge of cultivation for the company, and she's in charge of quality. She's a horticulture engineer. Then we'll have Emmanuel BOZON from the Aromates de Provence company, also in charge of cultures and agronomy engineer. And Léon van NIEKERK, that I think everybody knows here, which is in charge of cultivation for Darbonne. And he's a specialist in agricultural production methods, and he was the president of the conservatory for a long time. So we'll also have for this roundtable to have an additional vision from the academic world. We have a representative of the ANSES, Pierre CHAMPY from the Saclay University, who will join us to give us his vision on, well, as a pharmaconost and researcher, and as a person in charge of the plant group in ANSES. So I now leave the floor to production with Isabelle at first.
She's going to talk to us things that are being done in her field and which might have an impact on the regulation. Hello, everybody. In Promoplantes, as you said, we are a producer of medicinal plants. Our clients run from the pharmaceutical sector to food supplement and the cosmetic field. We really run the gamut of clients. We produce conventionally and using organic methods. And we have the particularity of producing internally and also working with producers. And I have great pleasure of following their crops externally, between, I think, 20 to 25 different species. So the production of annual plants, biennial and perennials. So different problems for monitoring and the following up of contaminant management, which are very different for each kind of species and each kind of annual growth. With contaminants, as you've been able to see up until now with the presentations that I have given you, the list of problems we might have, there are really 2 contaminants, and we've hardly touched on them. Problem that's gluten and allergens. We haven't really talked about, and these TAs, the troponic alkaloids, which I think everybody has looking at the PAs. We've spent a great deal of time on them because this is a huge problem for us, obviously, but I think these TAs are just as important. So upstream, What I'd like to say initially is that the issue regarding PAs and the standards that have been established, we've all heard about the 400 ppbs, this is actually enormous unfinished products. And as you heard, this standard has fallen as far as production levels. So we've kind of missed the part between production and consumer, and we said, well, manufacturer is going to manage this problem. And this standard then of 400 ppbs, we see that some of our clients saying, I don't want to take that risk. I would rather put the standard at 0 or at 50. And I think Denis is going to go into this in some detail, really tell us what it means. What does 400 ppb mean for what's happening in the field? So all of this is to say that this is a huge impact on management. So we had to adapt. We had to adapt our methods. Now, with regards general management of general contaminants, before we plant, we analyze all of the risks or the potential risks which might be related or might happen to a crop, particularly if something goes wrong with pesticides. We have to be careful of everything that happens in surrounding areas, surrounding the parcel of the plot, because you've already heard about pesticides. In many cases, it's external contamination which leads to the crops being affected. It's not necessarily the farmer or the producer himself using them. So before we plant, we pay attention to these potential risks. The presence of ragwort. There's ragwort everywhere. I can't think of one plot where there's not any. That's what I say to myself. I use this as a starting basis, that there's ragwort all year, whether this be in organic production or in conventional production. Then we have to look at heavy metals. Of course, that requires management of the soil and compost, and perhaps the sludge, which has been spread on the parcels as well. So then you have to be careful about which crop goes in which parcel and what could potentially arrive there. And then all of the producers have been warned, are very about the problem of ragwort, that they see even in conventional farming they're going to have to weed their plots by hand. So of course that's an economic impact. We tried to put a figure on this, bearing in mind that we're not really in the thick of things at the moment, because up until now, the standard has just been put in place. It'll be in a couple of years that we'll begin to see the economic impact of this reference, this standard. We've tried to quantify the cost of going to manual weeding. This doesn't actually give you an advance warning into what's going to happen for the final result, because we've seen different things happening. But we're talking about 0 to 30 centimes per kilo more, and that's without, So, you've done all the work upstream. We do the analysis, and we see that we're at 300, but we're under the 400 ppbs. But I know that you yourself, you've carried out some analysis. We've got 4 extracts at 300, under 300 ppbs. So in one single sample, we have analysis where we see the results are not coherent. So this is quite complex at lab level as well. We carry out the analysis. Our clients carry out their own analysis, and we have contradicting results. So what do we do with the batch? Therein lies the rub. What's more, I don't think we've got any clear vision at the moment or how we can manage this problem, because everything is done at production level. The client can come and validate the harvest. That's very good. And then finally, we discover that we've got 420 ppb per batch, so you can't do anything with the batch. Thank you, Isabelle, for this first illustration, this first example. So now I'd like to hand over to Emmanuel BOZON, who's going to talk about the problems in his particular sector. I represent the Aromates de Provence, which is a cooperative in the south of France. There are roughly 40 producers in the cooperative, and we specialize in really in thyme and basil. That's what we do. So we want to produce quality products. Provence herbs often have the red label stamp, and we want to have the same for our thyme, etc. So we have it's a small cooperative, roughly 2 million in turnover. We've got 7 full-time employees. We've got our members are members of the cooperative. We're going to do everything. We're going to sort, we're going to cut, and we're going to mix all the different herbs, all our herbs. We do that all together for our members. So many of our clients are in supermarkets and are very concerned with the food industry, everything we can use for barbecues, etc. Anyway, we're going to use these particular herbs and spices. Internally, we have a quality department, of course. We are about to pass under the ISO 22000 with the FC 22000 label. We have a quality reference manual, which allows us to cover all of the problems linked to contaminants, allergens, pesticides, everything we've discussed up until now. We always manage to comply with the specifications which have added to the constraints given by our clients. But the real issue that we encounter now and have done for some time, since 2000, these PAs, we have control elements in place, but the PAs are more complicated because we have this duality. We've got oregano and oregano, which is used in different herb mixtures. If oregano is in a mix, it's got to respect the under 400 ppb, whereas on its own it doesn't. Try and explain that to the suppliers. We also have two weeds which can contaminate all of the groups, and that's ragwort and also heliotropes. So we have to be very careful with all of that. We basically worked over 3 years to try and enforce any kind of controls, particularly for herbal teas in the English market. So we were cautious in the way we were working, and as of June 2002, we were obliged to furnish products which respect European regulation, so being under 400 ppb and a parcel of thyme or of savoury. When you look at the quantity of ragwort that you could have, all of that's put in a dryer with our supplier. But once the damage has been done because of ragwort, you can no longer use it. And that's where we got to a stage where there was a real bottleneck, which was no longer, we couldn't do very much on our side. We put manual weeding in place and set prices for that because the parcels have to be clean. We added 20 hours per harvest to ensure that there was nothing left. When you have wonderful cases, for example, this year, for 6 tons of product, you have parcels where there's absolutely nothing except the plant, which is wonderful. And in other places, you're going to find part of your batch has gone beyond 400 pp. It's not possible to do this all over. In spite of the implementation of all of the technical levers that we have, This is what we've been told to do for the last 2 or 3 years. It just doesn't work in some cases. Sometimes we don't know why. Is there a contamination? Is it horizontal contamination? We don't know. There's not really a great deal of technical data on this, on how things are contaminated within the field, contamination upstream, etc. We don't have a great deal of data there and diversification, etc. Some people are going to have to go into market gardening, make hay with their batches, etc. But there's no real data on what happens to the batches. And there's no real reason to explain why. And some people may have enormous amount of contamination with the prop beside it. Just does not. Very difficult to apply the standard to all of the parcels. So we have to look at what's happening in the field, and we hope that the whole sector can get together to try and do something about this 400 ppb standard so it can be coherent for everyone. For us, it's too complicated. We're managing to get by in spite of it all. But as long as this is in place, we can see that things are going right. I'm not going to talk about a comprehensive level. We're not talking about huge buyers, etc. We're a small industry in the south of France. If you look at the Mediterranean basin, you have to see what the consequence would be there. We know that at some point there's going to be a problem with supply. At the industrial level, the real problem has been the representation of samples. So we've lengthened our production processes because we base our analysis after sorting. We take samples. For 1 ton of time, there are regulations in place. You have to be representative. You have to have 50 big bags. We do that. We do that at sorting, but we have everything upstream for checking to make sure that everything was within limits. And we have to make sure, of course, that the parcels are clean. We have a large problem linked to the respecting of this standard at 400 ppb.
Merci Emmanuel. Donc on va enchaîner avec Léon qui lui va nous parler de sa problématique dans son entreprise.
Well, many things have been said. I'm not going to bring anything new to the table, perhaps, but for the company, I'm Arbon Aromatics. That's the company for which I work, but from the agronomic section. We produce aromatic plants for the food industry, for thing B2C. So we have a main factory near Paris in Mille-Ferroy. We've got one in Brittany, one in the south of Spain, and another one in California, which covers the North American market. So we have the production of all the plants, transformation, dehydration of plants. That was our historic industry. Now we freeze them as well. We're very active still in dehydrating plants. I don't think that the freezing is really concerned by the problem with 400 ppb at the moment. This is something that's going to happen. We're all going to be concerned by the same norms. So I've been asked to talk about 2 issues. I'm not going to come back on pesticides or heavy metals. I could talk about it for ages, but I don't think that's the goal of today. I'm going to talk about alkaloids. I'm going to talk about the modern-day contaminant, which is very pressing. We didn't really see this coming initially, this problem. It does concern us now. Today, in terms of mastering the situation with parsley and basil, etc., we can do it. We can do it without too much difficulty because we can manage the reserves we have in our crop rotations. We have quite a stock between when you have crop rotation. We have a stock of seeds. The problem we have is perhaps with the perennials, like oregano, tarragon, mint, etc., where there's a mechanical process involved. But here we're in a sort of scissor effect between the standard and the disappearance.
Depuis 4 ans, on a perdu
Besides,
juste comme un coup de ciseau les meilleurs produits. Et il se trouve en plus que donc, le culture de l'estragon, sur lequel je vais un focus un peu particulier,
tarragon, which I'm going to focus on, comes from the same botanic family as ragwort. And
donc, ce qui marche déjà est encore plus réduit.
You can see what works in these cases is very complicated.
Pratiquement de l'année, hein, et quelques semaines, elle permet d'étouffer les mauvaises herbes.
So after a few weeks, it kills those weeds, and so it was a product that was very important to us because we're a leader in Tarragon. So now we're faced with a real difficulty with the disappearance of those herbicides. To keep compliant with the regulations, we're not sure that we'll be able to keep producing. I've been asked how much it costs. In terms of extra weeding, it's hundreds of thousands of euros. Now we're having batches that are non-compliant, so it's once again thousands of euros down the drain. But some producers are happy to, bill the consumer for this extra work, but it's going to be an issue to really find the supplies at the end of the day. So for contaminants, and second point I wanted to mention, and I'm talking about all contaminants, is the piling up of standards. When you have a contaminant that you want to avoid, you have protocols to implement, and it's been explained how you try to face this problem. We manage to comply, and once in a while there will be a non-compliance. If you add a second layer of contaminants to avoid with microbiology, heavy metals, and so on, with a piling up of contaminant regulations, it will become impossible to be fully compliant with everything. We work a lot for baby food, and I have children, so I'm very happy that there are standards in that sector. But every year they added a standard. And what happens with baby food is usually a vision of what happens in the future for the rest of the food. So 5 to 10 years later, we observed the same trend in normal food. And so now I can see that it's difficult to even just produce, just trying to comply with all these standards and regulations. This is one of our fear for our trade.
Merci.
Thank you.
Professeur Champy, peut-être qu'aussi de votre côté, si vous pouvez, par rapport à ce qui a été présenté sur l'amont-aval, amener votre point de vue de chercheur également, de responsable de groupe Palances, pour un petit peu rebondir et avoir vos commentaires par rapport à ce que vous avez pu entendre cet après-midi et partager votre vision également avec nous. Merci beaucoup.
Merci. Je tiens à préciser que je ne m'exprime pas au nom de l'ANSES.
I'm not talking on behalf of ANSES. I am an expert for the ANSES, but I don't represent them here. The topics at stake are about the product status, pharmaceutical and so on. With pharmaceutical, you have systematic controls. For food and cosmetics, it's a risk control with good practices mainly, with more leeway in terms of methods used for controls. Especially for food supplements with plants, the regulation says that the control methods that are applied are either pharmacopoeia or other methods, even internal methods. So it's not exactly the same level of pressure in terms of control and costs and frequency of analysis. Now the non-compliance is aiming at protecting consumers, so I don't think it's being brand new or reassessed regularly. This comes from toxicology knowledge. So the thing is that we need to reevaluate our knowledge regularly. For PAs, for instance, it's very worrying in terms of the long-term production. For the exposition risk, there are epidemiological issues, and I agree with what Dennis suggested. But ANSES cannot really impact these issues. So it has to come from ministries, health ministry, agricultural ministry, and we need to find a European consensus to find ways to assess PAs. However, it's difficult to extract one contaminant from its group of toxic elements, because toxic is toxic. However, exposure thresholds are set, but it's difficult to have specific cases for everything. So back to health agencies. Contaminants for the plant group in the ANSES is not a major issue because our group works on toxicity of preparations or plants themselves. And there's a lot to do in terms of assessing the literature, suggesting the protection of consumers from operators. So contaminants are being discussed, but in the point of view of those that are most recurring in some preparations or some plants. Given accidents that actually happened for toxic plants that were used in diet pills, as we heard in Alexandre's presentation. So then we can try some amphetamine that were fraudulously added, and there were already accidents in the US, in France. We keep monitoring these kind of exceptional cases because it relates to existing actual accidents that happened. So we're not thinking about contaminants in general. It's not our focus. Still, when ANSES is starting to work on plants or food, it can require from the DGCCRF to operate a control on the sector and to look for contaminants that could actually provoke health issues. When talking about medicinal plants, and Denis gave you a log list, these issues are real. Some accidents can be actually very bad in large producing countries. If you look at the rates of heavy metals in plants and end products based on medicinal plants in India, China, and accidents related to exposure to these products, it's not reassuring. It's not because a plant crosses boundaries, borders, and takes a boat, that contaminants will not be a problem anymore. Thank you. So before leaving the floor to the audience to ask your questions, I would ask you to give them a round of applause. So, 2 words of conclusion. We can see that there is a piling up of regulations, a stacking of regulations to protect consumers. We all agree on that. What we've observed recently, we talked a lot about alkaloids today. And the feeling we get is that it's maybe the first time that we feel that we went too fast in setting up a regulation, because there are debates that are necessary for the dose and for the analytical method. It was the same with the ETO crisis, because we ended up with a notion of uncertainty, which means that no one is happy with the consensus, because we can't find the tools to implement that regulation. And nothing is clear on what has to be done. Is there even a solution? And so little by little, we might reach a stage where the whole development of the sector could be impacted, and maybe the whole business could be impacted. And we want to develop a strong French MAP sector in a safe framework to face worldwide competition. And so for alkaloids, it really questions our sectors, and we need to find solutions together, because the notion of analysis and analytical method and how do we implement those at a larger scale with every producer, it's a real basic question. If you go to have a test on your cholesterol, wherever you go in France, every laboratory will give you the same result. For plants, we can see that it's not happening. It's not what's happening in real life, and it leads to a real difficulty for our sector. Because we have found a way to control most of contaminants, for which analytical methods are not an issue. For pesticides, yes, external contamination is a real issue, and it has to be taken into account, because there are some cultures that are both conventional and next to organic. So these are difficulties that can, bring difficulties in analysis. But standardizing analysis and analytical method is really important. And is it worked on at an academic level? Because I think the research world has a role to play to really find solutions. So this notion I wanted to bring, that does new regulation bring a new vision, especially with this Article 8, because there's a notion of interpretation of data. Does the prevention principle sometimes not hinder an entire economic sector? That's what we feel. And I think there is the need for collective work so that we come up with a standardized framework for everyone, because the biggest risk for production is the branch that will carry the weight of this responsibility at the end of the day. We need to have a vision to lift all these uncertainties. I think the market is asking for it. We need a framework to work within that doesn't change every second day and that is not fluctuating all the time and requires adaptation every day. Because the timeline for regulations and the timeline for agriculture are different timelines. Everything takes time, and we need a collective effort to find solutions. That was my conclusion, and now you have the floor to comment and ask questions.
So where are we with regards to the debate between PAs at European level, between the different European member states and producing countries, obviously? Well, I think it's sorted. There is an European regulation which came into force on the 1st of January this year, covering 12 different categories, whether it was oregano, no oregano, tea, not tea, etc. There is an EU regulation now which covers a part of the food sector. In the term of the pharma world, there isn't regulation, but there is a method. This is the official method. However, it's not very clear if we have to appear it to the raw material or to the finished product. And I would say now, whatever I think about this method, which is completely shocking, I think it gives rise to results, and we build standards around this. I'll talk about it later briefly, but if we apply all the quantities ingested when you've got a food supplement, 2 grams, 4 grams, or a tea, whether it's 5 tens or 10 grams, in half of the cases we're going to absorb more than 1 microgram of alkaloids per day. How they tell us that from that dose we could have liver cancer. So perhaps this shouldn't actually be written in the standard, or it's not true, but I don't think we should be bringing it to the table if it's not true. Now, what I asked was then, why can't we just have a validation post factum? Everybody can be wrong. Everybody can make a mistake. But why can't we change it? Can we say that in 2 years we're going to do an epidemiological study on this? Because people have died of liver cancer, and amongst the victims, how many can we link that to drinking a litre of tea or herbal tea? That's the kind of irreversible character of the method, which I find abhorrent. Once it's done, it's done. They don't want to turn around and come back over things. So this is for pharma and for plants. There is no official method for the food sector, but they actually have a standard. But I think, you need to see where the mistakes are. You need to question this. I think it's professional bodies to challenge this and to serve as a check on this. Perhaps there are directives to give to operators as well with regards to the methodology, which you have to apply. I'm going to be a little more optimistic than Denis. I think, of course, you should be able to come to go back and change things. In September, ANSES declared, they pronounced 2 opinions on contaminants with regards to water quality, which were reviewed, and this was metallochloride, and it went from 0.1 micrograms per litre to 0.9. So we've multiplied this by 9. Multiplied or increased a factor 9 the threshold. This contaminant suddenly has become it's gone from it's changed statute, shall we say. It was not relevant and now it is. So some lobbies do work well. They put pressure on the system to make sure things are reviewed and changed. And if we can do that with water, then that could be applied to other sectors as well. Water quality hasn't perhaps been improved in any way, but it's the standard that's changed. I hope that you're going to be able to enjoy the same kind of performance in your sector. Thank you. Well, to continue the exchange with what you said, talking at European level, I think turning round and coming back on what we've said, without regulation, for me, it seems very complicated today. However, what's sure is that these debates on the establishment of this regulation, which has become law, well, I don't think you can come back on them. What is sure is that today that there is an inapplicability. It's not tenable. In fact, I don't even know if that word exists in French. Of asking for the food supplement industry, but everybody can understand that for their own particular branch. I think it's really impossible to stick to in any kind of durable fashion, and that is why the syndicates have a role to play, to be a relay between what's happening in the field, down with the operators and the companies that we represent, and what the authorities are doing in order to protect the population, because that's the end goal. So I think that's where we have to work, and we have to work together as much as we possibly can. And in this field, there's a lot to be done together, whether this is at European or French level, at local level, at district level, at regional level, and even, why not, super-regional. We're working on it. We are working on it. And I hope that the next time I come to talk to you about this subject, it will be to talk about our results. I want to come back and talk about a review that was done on security thresholds for water contaminants. There was lobbying in place. There is no lobbying when it comes to risk assessment when you're talking about a conflict of interest as it was applied by the NSM and ANSES, what's an assessment agency in France. It's been taken very seriously and has an enormous impact. I began to work with Denis on an industrial group. We're talking about the evaluation of APs, or PAs. I was asked to leave this group because there was a risk of conflict of interest. On the other hand, it's not the evaluation assessment agencies that set the standards. This is what that comes from work, that they establish the regulation and the standards. We are going towards more and more drastic standards, and the EFSA has pronounced about re-examining all of the PAs that were talked about earlier. I wanted to come back to what I said as well, because coming back on regulation, I think to come back and redefine regulation is complicated, but I think where we really missed a loop is we started doing a list of what was available, of list that was achievable. I'm not a toxicologist, but this was forecast. There were exemptions. For some plants, there were exemptions to be made. We realized that there was a problem with these plants. And I think where the problem is, and it's the Germans that were very reactive, they had lots of data. In France, we underestimated the problem, and the regulation was drawn up based on a database that was too weak and was drawn up too quickly. So today, we shouldn't be coming back on the regulation in any kind of exemptive fashion. We should be looking at all of the herbs and spices at 1,000 ppm, for example. There are a certain number of plants, oregano, for example, we have the great difficulty of reaching, getting under 400, as we know, so there should be some perhaps derogation for those. And I don't think that's actually reviewing the regulation, it's actually creating some exemptions. I think we might have to come to an end. I've got a last question, please, and then we're going to move on to the break. Well, I have a comment to make, if I may, before my presentation with regards to the European Commission, because it's not in my presentation, it's fairly recent, the discussion concerning this regulation that we've been talking about. I think there is the beginning of a consensus in the research world on the difference of toxicity between alkaloids. So rather than having a comprehensive measure or to consider that all of the alkaloids which are measured are equal in terms of toxicity, we can say they're not. And perhaps we should have a correction factor put in place for toxicity. I exchanged with the European Commission recently on this subject, and also with regards data collection, which I spoke about earlier. It's been said these standards have been based on data which was collective, data which is quite weak, with great parts missing. And so what we would suggest is to make sure that the security agency includes more data into the documents, and then they could change their approach to alkaloids. So this is, if you like, this is an ongoing discussion. We're also talking about how they could have a consensus, a scientific consensus, which we could then publish, because now there are some studies that are following this trend. And then I think that the research must publish just now so that EFSA accepts to consider it, accepts this in consideration, but it is ongoing. Well, thank you very much for this precision. It gives us a little bit more hope, I think, especially with some alkaloids, if that magical figure of 400 could be adapted. And now we're going to conclude. Well, Denis wants to say something again. I want to. No, I can say it later in my presentation. There's no problem. Regulation of July this year is based on results, certain results. Now, why oregano should be allowed 300, 400? Well, why? Because it's been pulled up by the same values which are present in the German market. Now, when we have statistics on results of the analysis, well, oregano is usually contaminated, so we're going to put it up at 800. But in the introduction to this document, which was published 3 years ago, and they said this was going to happen, that July was going to see the publishing of this act, they said, we're leaving you some time so you could start work cleanly, really, and diminish the contaminants in the field. Last year, a German group, which gets together every year to talk about PAs, what did they do? They concluded that in spite of all the efforts that have been put in place for the last few years, they cannot make sure that the PAs, the content of PAs, fall any further down the scale in Europe. So there's always going to be about 50% of plants, and I think it's just in the pharma centre, they always have 50% of the plant batches which are not compliant. So there's a theory that says we have a standard, but we're going to lower it in a few years because people would have made headway and will learn to work correctly. But actually, no, we realize that this is not possible. There is a threshold, and we can't get underneath it because it's too expensive if you look at the cost price and many other reasons, and we cannot technically do this. This was a very theoretical vision that once was had, so how are we going to resolve this? I will come back on the epidemiological data later, but, how can we do this? And now I'm going to stop. Thank you, Denis. Thank you, everybody. Thank you to all the participants. Thank you for being present for the time we're able, and thank you to you all for your participation.